Before we go further, we want to do some initial setup of FreeBSD and OPNsense that will permit us to do future labs in security. This is the network setup that I have here in my office. You may need to modify some of what I do for the actual IP addresses and setup in your configuration, but make sure you look at the configuration of your OPNsense setup and make modifications as we show in this tutorial. My WAN network is 172 here. This is the internet side. My cloud's over here. It's using DHCP to give me addresses here. So I have not set static addresses for OPNsense or my host machine. So this is my host OS X machine that's running all the virtual machines here. I have OPNsense running on FreeBSD in a VM, and inside the LAN I have an OS X VM as well. My OPNsense network here is .80, that's its DHCP address, and this is .35, my host. So these are the addresses you'll see as we work through this. Now if we look at the initial configuration, we'll look at our dashboard and see some of the services and gateway we have. One of the first things you want to make sure that you do whenever you set up any type of security appliance or router is change the password. So change the old password, or standard password is OPNsense. Change that to something easy you can remember. I've just changed mine here to Sense, S-E-N-S-E, and saved that. Under the reporting option here, you can see some of the health of your system. It will show you some of the packets in and out, the traffic. It'll give you some report settings, some traffic graphs. We're not going to use that yet, but it may be something we look at in future, but it'll give you an idea of traffic patterns that are working in your network. One of the first things we want to make sure that's working for OPNsense and for the FreeBSD OS that is hosting it is the gateway. And if you go to System, Gateways, you'll see a name of the gateway here. And it's getting it from DHCP, but typically this is a static assignment. And if you hit the eyes here, you can sort of get a little more information. So you can set your gateway IP address here. My gateway is .250, so that's what would be here as my default gateway. The other thing we want to make sure is working is our DNS service. And if we look at services, you can see that one of the options here is a DNS forwarder. You want to enable DNS forwarding. If we look at our LAN networks here, you want to make sure that they can access a DNS that's forwarded off to a proper DNS server. So we're just using a DNS forwarder to be set up here. We then want to make sure that OPNsense can actually get out and hit DNSs properly. To do that, we would bring up the OPNsense command line environment here. We'll go to the shell. We'll use the nslookup command. We'll look at what our server is, and it's pointing to itself, and then it will forward that to the here, the 172.16.0.1 service. So if we just look at some FQDN, we'll look at apple.com. As long as we can resolve that and get an IP address, everything is fine for our gateway and for our DNS resolution. We're now looking at the OS X virtual machine inside our LAN network. You'll see it's statically assigned at 10.1.1.2. We've assigned the OPNsense interface as the router and the DNS service. And we want to make sure that this machine can get to the internet. We can see we can bring up Google, so everything seems to work fine. Make sure you get or go to packetsender.com and download the Packet Sender app. What that's going to allow us to do in a future lab is to send UDP and TCP packets back and forth through the firewall, so we can look at see how that firewall works. So you can do a download here. I just put that on my desktop for when I want to use it in a future lab. Next, we want to bring up our command line environment again, make sure our date and time, especially our time zone, is correct. And we want to look at making sure that NTP, the network time protocol, is working properly in OPNsense. So if I do a date, I can see that I have the right time here, but I'm pretty sure your initial system is not going to have the right time or the right time zone. Note that we have ADT as their time zone. So let's see where we would get that from. I'll just minimize this. If we go to our system settings, we can see a host name. You may want to change the name of your OPNsense security appliance. Local domain is fine, but our time zone should be America. I'm in Nova Scotia, so I choose Glace Bay. You may have to play around with time zones if there's not one that's obvious. And then you would want to save that. And sometimes there's a setting up here that says apply the configuration. After you do that, you can go back and run the date command again and make sure that this is the proper time right here. Especially for certificates, anything that's encrypted, any services that you're going to connect to, you want to make sure your time is right. Sometimes those services fail. We're next going to look at making sure the network time protocol service is properly configured. We can go to Services, Network Time, and if we look at General, you'll see a different pool here, probably one from the Netherlands. And if we look at what our pool should be from Canada, we can just search for NTP Pool Canada. We can see it should be ca.pool.ntp.org. So we should change this setting. This is our preferred time server here. Now if you've just made the change, it may take a while to synchronize, but if you look at the status, you should see something like this here. We're hitting a stratum 2 time server properly. We've got a little bit of offset, but this indicates it's connected to the and getting network time properly from a time server. The last item you may want to configure in some of the labs is the NAT setting, and that's under Firewall. By default, if we look at Outbound Nat, what that means is that by default, everything from our 10 network here is going to use NAT and be translated to the WAN address, this 172 address. So anything from the LAN into the WAN, you won't see this address. NAT will translate it. There are times when we may want to turn that off, and you would disable that by clicking here, hitting Save, and then applying the change. For some future lab, we're going to want to disable the NAT. Now, when you disable NAT, your internal LAN VM machine, the OS X machine, may not be able to hit the internet, but we can still do some firewall labs between the WAN and the LAN. So I'll leave this enabled, but here's where you go to disable that, and we'll work more with that in future labs. Finally, we'll look at some of the network settings on our host machine here that we may have to make. Now, the host, by default, its gateway is going to point this way, because if we have something that's bound not for the local network, generally it's bound for somewhere in the internet, and we'll want to hit this 250 gateway. But if we're doing some firewall labs between the LAN and the WAN, for instance, if I'm sending a packet here, and it's coming from the 10.1.1.2 host, then this machine may want to return to that same address. And what will happen is if our gateway points here, it simply makes a routing decision. Hey, is it for the local network? No. If it's not, it's going to go for the gateway. Well, that won't work and our lab won't work. So there are times when we may have to change our gateway to point to this machine here. Now OS X makes that fairly convenient to do, because if we go to the network settings, we can make a new location. We'll edit location, hit the plus, give it a name. I've given it a name, OPNsense here. And if we just simply check that, we can make whatever configurations we want. So I've manually set the same address as DHCP is giving me, subnet mask, but notice my router here is the OPNsense NIC on the WAN side right here. And my DNS server, though, is upstream in my cloud, which is that's my normal DNS server in this network here. Typically, you're not going to need to use the DNS server for some of these basic firewall labs. So if I'm doing a firewall lab and I want to make sure that I return packets to the internal LAN, you may have to make this setting. I have a setting here for Office, which goes back to DHCP, and I get my normal settings that allow this host to be able to resolve and send and retrieve stuff from the internet side. We've now made some initial configurations for OPNsense. We are sure that we can retrieve information from the internet and that our internal LAN machines work properly. We should be ready for future labs.